Thank you, Gordon, for that lovely introduction. And thank you for the music. I didn't want it to stop. And thank you, Seven Oaks, for inviting me so warmly to come today to share with you some of my thoughts about the environment and the kingdom of heaven. You know, on such a day as this, with the sun shining and the music and the flowers, it's so easy to envisage the kingdom of heaven right here on earth, isn't it? You see, this is what heaven's like. This is what it's all about. And you can see from today's weather what an effect our environment can have upon us. When we see the sun shining and the flowers and the music, our hearts lift and we respond. But perhaps on a gloomy winter day, when things aren't going too well and the weather's terrible, we can become so depressed by our environment that we see again the effect that it's having upon us. Now, part of the definition of the word environ means to form a ring around. And it would appear to the material senses that we're all environed in something. Really, every problem that we have in life boils down to an environmental problem. You can be environed in a family relationship situation, something at your work that just isn't right, something in your church, your community, your world, unemployment. Sometimes we sit and watch the news in the evening on television and we see terrible things that are happening in our world. And that too can have quite an effect upon us, upon our environment. Another way that we can feel environed is when we feel environed inside a material body from which we would just love to get out and feel free. And I, as a Christian Scientist, feel privileged today to have an opportunity to just talk over with you some of the things that Christian Science has taught me about environment and how it has been teaching me that we really don't need to change our environment, but our thoughts about our environment. Let me give you an illustration. For many years in Northern Ireland, my family and I lived right in the thick of the Troubles. We lived on the front of a busy main road. The house that we lived in was in between the two factions of our community. On the left of us, there was the IRA and all the Republican sympathizers. They were just up the road to the left. And down the road to the right, we had the Loyalist UDA and all their sympathizers. And our house, a row of houses, were just caught in the middle. And when the Troubles there were really bad, when they were at their peak, and they had been going on for quite a few years, and I remember thinking that my youngest daughter had been born into these Troubles. And I think about this time she might have been about 10 years old. And began to wonder, were they ever going to go over? Were my family going to be brought up in this sort of community? Were they going to be brought up to believe that that was their environment, this was the natural way of life? and I felt I wanted something better for my family. Well, we had tried to sell our house, but because of where it was situated, no one wanted to buy it. No one would even come to look at it. And every night there were burning buses and cars outside our door, and people would not go out after 6. Everything came to a standstill in the evenings, and life certainly was not normal. The children couldn't have normal activities, and we couldn't go out, and for a long time I couldn't even get to church. And sometimes there would be gunmen in my little front garden, and they all wore khaki-coloured masks on their faces. At first it used to be the army, and I used to bring them down mugs of coffee and tea. Then I went out one night, and when I was talking to them, I realised I was talking to the IRA and giving them mugs of tea. Another time I went out and I found out it was the UDA, the loyalist terrorists, that I was entertaining. And I have been praying very hard about this situation, but one day it sort of came to a peak. 13 bombs exploded inside 1 hour, and this was over a lunchtime. We heard one, then another, and another, and another. And when it got to about 5, and our house was shaking and some windows had broken, I was at the stage of not knowing what to do. I was in the house alone, and my children went to 2 schools which were close by, and I wondered if I should run up to their school to see if they were all right. I remember going out to the door, standing at the front door of my house, and I watched people running in all directions. They didn't know where to run to. And one elderly woman passed my door and just looked at me silently. And she looked so sad and anxious and frightened that I came into the house and felt terribly hopeless and helpless. And I remember getting down on my knees and praying, Father, please take me and my family out of this situation. I don't care if this house sells or it doesn't sell. Just get us out of here. This is no way to bring up children. There must be something better. I was crying and feeling very hopeless and very depressed and frightened. And then I got up and washed my face, and I noticed that on my dining room table was a Christian Science monitor, which had come in on Monday morning, but this was Friday, and I still hadn't opened it. And as I was taking the monitor out of its wrapper, I remember thinking, if God could grant me one petition right now, what would I ask of him? I thought I wished that he could put me and my family on a big aeroplane and take us round the world until he could find a nice peaceful spot and drop us off. Then I thought, well, that's not very likely to happen. So I will go around the world on the Christian Science monitor. I'll take a trip around the world. So I got the Christian Science monitor, and I started reading the articles on the front page. I just read a little bit to give me the gist of each story. And after I got through 8 pages, I realized I'd visited 16 countries. I also realized that their problems were not so different to ours, that we were not unique Now at that moment, that helped me, because I honestly thought we were the only country in the world that were having all these troubles. And it helped me to see that we were not unique. I began to feel a bit calmer, and I began to ask myself, what is my need right now? Is my need really to get out of here? And then I thought, no, my need right now is for me to be able to pray more effectively. Because I felt the prayers that I was making, the tearful prayers, asking God to get us out of the country, were not having much effect. And that this sort of praying wasn't doing me much good. So I began to think, to ask God to help me to pray more effectively. Then I remembered that Mrs. Mary Baker Eddy, the author of Science and Health, the Key to the Scriptures, has a beautiful chapter on prayer. And I opened this chapter towards the end, and I read these words. In order to pray aright, we must enter into the closet and shut the door. We must close the lips and silence the material senses. In the quiet sanctuary of earnest longing, we must deny sin and plead God's allness. She goes on to say, our Master taught his disciples one brief prayer, which we name after him the Lord's Prayer. Our Master said, after this manner therefore pray ye. And then he gave that prayer which covers all human needs. Mrs. Eddy says that one prayer covers all human needs. She also says, only as we rise above all material sensuousness and sin can we reach the heaven-born aspiration and spiritual consciousness which is indicated in the Lord's Prayer and which instantaneously heals the sick. Now that's what Mrs. Eddy said about the Lord's Prayer. It instantaneously heals the sick. Well, I was sick of this problem. And I began to think, yes, Jesus only left us one prayer. So he must have thought that that prayer was adequate to meet all our needs. So if that prayer is adequate to meet all our needs, it's adequate to meet my needs right here and now. So I'm going to pray with the Lord's Prayer, with this situation in mind. And I began to go through the Lord's Prayer something like this. Our Father. And when I said, our Father, I thought about what that meant. It didn't say, my Father, or the Father of my children. It said, our Father. Now, who did that include? It included all mankind. It included everyone in my country. It didn't say Protestant or Catholic. It said, our Father. So that included everyone in my community, no matter what side of the fence they thought they were on. God was our Father, and that gave us something in common. That also included all the people who had just been blown up. The people who had been killed in these 13 bombs that had just gone off. I knew there would be many people killed. But I knew that our Father was still their Father. I knew that God made man spiritual, and that the true spiritual identity of each one of those people was already intact and at home with our Father. Then I prayed for the relatives of those people, and I knew that that included them too. He was also their Father, and He was there to comfort. Our Father is love, and He was there comforting each and every one of those people. He was comforting the people of my community. He was the Father of all the security forces who had to do this work. He was the Father of all the doctors and surgeons and hospitals who had to take care of this. He was the Father of every minister of every church, no matter what their denomination. He was the Father of all. This, our Father, left no one out. It embraced everyone in our community. It even embraced the terrorists, because God was Father of all. The next line said, "Which art in heaven." And here I began to see that our Father, who is God, who is divine love, who is infinite spirit, dwells eternally in heaven. So it wasn't that God was down here with us in our problems. He was in heaven. He saw His creation intact as He made it. He saw His beautiful universe the way He created it, in which there were no wars, no separations, no divisions, only love and harmony and unity, and the perfect man of His creation intact. So then I reasoned, well, if our Father is in heaven, if He dwells there eternally, and heaven is a divine and holy state of consciousness, then I and my children and family, relatives, and all the people of this community are really in heaven right now, where our Father is. And in heaven there's only peace. This peace was already present. Thy kingdom come. Here I prayed that God would help us to see His kingdom come, right here, where we only saw this war situation. Thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Here I prayed that He would help us to see His will being done right here on earth as it is in heaven, right here in Ireland as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. As I prayed that, I prayed, Father, give us fresh inspiration. Give us spiritual discernment to see what You see, to feel what You feel right now. And forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Now that was the hard bit, because I began at that point to reason, Surely God couldn't mean that we should ask God to forgive the people who went out deliberately and planted 13 bombs to blow people to pieces. Surely he couldn't mean that. Well, I got my Bible again and I went back to the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. And I read this. Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbour and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you. And pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. There was a condition attached to it. In order for me to know I was a child of God, I had to do this. That ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. For if ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans the same? And if ye salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. So I saw that that was an order. That was a commandment. I had to pray for my enemies. And I began to know, well, if I really believed that all those people had not died, that they were still alive, that they were still one with their Father in heaven, then in truth, no one had ever been killed. So in the kingdom of heaven, there weren't any victims, but there were not any villains either. So I began to see that the IRA were not villains. They were just people who were being used. And I prayed that their eyes would be opened, that they could see a better way to have their cause that they believed in so strongly served than by these means of violence. I was really able to pray for them. And lead us not into temptation. I prayed that God would keep us from being tempted to hate or to retaliate, but deliver us from evil. Deliver us from believing in evil, in a power apart from God. The last line of the prayer said, For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. And when I came to that line, I saw, yes, there's only one kingdom, the kingdom of heaven. This isn't the United Kingdom or part of the United Kingdom. It's the kingdom of heaven, and it's intact right here and now. Thine is the kingdom and the power. So the power did not belong to evil. It was God's power. And the glory. And here I understood that only God could have the glory out of this experience. That evil or terrorists or the IRA could not claim the glory because it was God's. You know what happened? When I got through that prayer, I felt more at peace I felt like I was in heaven, that I'd never been out of it. And the wonderful thing was, when I came down to it, that everything was as it was before I said the Lord's Prayer. 13 bombs had still gone off. A lot of people had been killed and injured. A lot of people had been left homeless. But I had been lifted into this wonderful sense of the kingdom of heaven, right here. I felt so uplifted that honestly I wanted to open my doors and windows and shout out to people, just come in here till I tell you what I've just discovered. Well, I soon had an opportunity to do that, because about half an hour after that my doorbell rang. I went out to the door and a man was standing on the step, and as I opened the door he collapsed into my hallway. I kneeled down beside him and I had to pull him in and shut the door. And I noticed that his face was very purple and there was foam coming out of his mouth, and he was pointing towards his heart. And I could see that this was some sort of a heart attack. Now at first I panicked. I didn't quite know what to do with the man, because I knew that the hospitals were overburdened. I didn't know where I would find a doctor. I didn't know who the man was. So I simply kneeled beside him, and I had a tea apron round my waist. I took the tea apron and I wiped his face and I took his hand. And I said to him, I don't know who you are. I don't know what side of the fence you're from, but it doesn't really matter. I said, I know that whatever church you belong to, or whatever religion, you say the Lord's Prayer. And that's the prayer that unites us all. And I said, I've just been saying the Lord's Prayer, and it has really helped me. So I'm going to say the Lord's Prayer with you. And if you know it, you just say it silently. You don't need to say it out. I held his hand, and I closed my eyes, and I kneeled on the floor beside him, and I went right through the Lord's Prayer just as I've done with you. And as I got to the last line, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, I opened my eyes, and I could see the color coming right back into his face, from his chin right up. And his eyes lit up, and he said to me, I feel so much better. I said, that's good. I got him up and got him onto a settee. And I said, I'll go make you a cup of tea and a sandwich or something to eat. And as we were having this cup of tea together, he began to tell me his story. He told me that about 2 months ago, his home had been bombed, and his wife was in the house at the time, and she was killed. And they only had one daughter, aged about 19. So after the funeral, he took the daughter to Blackpool, I think, on a holiday, to try to sort out what they were going to do about their lives. Should they move away from Northern Ireland or try and get a house and live there? While they were in Blackpool, the daughter became very ill, took a heart attack and died. And the man came home. He had no home, no wife, no daughter. And on his first day home, he took a heart attack, was taken to the hospital, had been in there for several weeks, and this morning was his first day out. And all these bombs went off, and he didn't know where to run. So he rang my doorbell. Well, I was able to let him stay in my home for a while, until we found the minister from his church, some social workers, and after a few weeks they were able to find him somewhere to live, and I kept in contact with him for quite a few years. Well, I can tell you that I felt very grateful that that man didn't ring my doorbell an hour previous to that, because if he had have done, I would have been down on the same level as he was. But because of the Lord's Prayer and the wonderful power in it, I was so lifted up that I was able to help him too. And ever since then, the Lord's Prayer has meant so very much to me. It has such power that when we really think it through, because how often do we say the Lord's Prayer, even in church, but we do it so automatically that we don't really think the words through for ourselves. I've lost my place. It was interesting that after that, the circumstances in my life began to change. My eldest son got a job in London because the shop that he worked for had been bombed. He was sent over to London to work and liked it very much. Then 4 of my children had the opportunity to attend Fancourt and Claremont School. And there they were completely lifted out of this situation into what seemed to them and me the kingdom of heaven. They who had been brought up in this sort of atmosphere thought when they first saw Claremont that it was heaven. And the love that they were shown from every member of staff, the help that we were given to enable my children to go there, the generous bursaries and help from many, many people, opened up a new world for them and for me. It also left me free to enter the public practice of Christian Science. I became a journalistic practitioner, which is someone who dedicates all her time to helping others as she herself has been helped. Wasn't it interesting that my circumstances didn't have to change? I at first had been praying that God would take us out of Northern Ireland, that our house would sell. But it was the other way around. I had to change my concept of my environment, and then my circumstances changed for the better. A whole new world opened up for us all. And the Lord's Prayer, as in heaven, so on earth, was demonstrated in our experience. It was so interesting for me to learn that I simply had to change my thoughts. This helped me on many occasions afterwards when the IRA did similar things. It helped me to pray much more effectively. It also helped me to see that I did not want to get up and run away. I wanted to stay and be a part of the solution. Because after I got all this from the Lord's Prayer, I really felt I didn't want to run away. I felt that Northern Ireland was the best and the healthiest place to live. I would recommend it to any of you. So through this experience and many others, I had found the answer to all the questions that I had been asking myself about my environment. because my environment at that time looked pretty bleak. Right throughout the Bible, we have wonderful, inspiring accounts of prophets overcoming great calamities and disasters that were taking place in their communities. And taking a fresh look at them, they were not so different from the atrocities that are taking place in our world today. Let's look at a few of these prophets. Take Moses, for instance. His people were sold into bondage, slavery, great oppression, and his heart ached to be able to help them. He must have felt so helpless before the wickedness, terrorism, and sin that confronted him. But then he had that wonderful experience with the burning bush, which I think is a bit like my experience with the Lord's Prayer. Perhaps he saw it wasn't his environment, but his concept of it that needed to change. Suddenly he heard God calling him and telling him that he had chosen Moses to bring the people out of slavery and oppression and to lead them into a new free land, a land flowing with milk and honey, a place where all could live in freedom. Can you imagine what it must have been like for a man to be told that God had chosen you? Moses doubted it. He said to God, but they won't believe me, nor hearken to my voice. Then God showed Moses that by signs and miracles he could persuade them. Moses had to be convinced in his own mind that he really was chosen or called of God, because it was this special calling or closeness to God that empowered him and gave him the strength to do everything he needed to do to change his environment and the environment of his people. This was true for many of the prophets. There's Joseph, David, Elijah, Jeremiah. Then look at Jesus. Just think what his environment was like. There was every disease under the sun. The diseases were not so different to the diseases that we have today. They might have had different names, but they were the same diseases. Look at the poverty, the crime, dishonesty, injustice, terrorism, and every type of disease, both physical and mental. But Jesus overcame them all, even death itself. And not just for himself. Not just for others, but also for himself. Look what one man did. The kingdom of heaven established right here on earth. He didn't say after we die. He didn't tell people you have to die to get into the kingdom of heaven. He demonstrated it for them right here and right now. He also left us this wonderful Lord's Prayer, which not only teaches us how to pray the prayer of humility and petition to God, but also the prayer of affirmation, affirming that he really is God, the only Creator, the all-powerful, the Father and Mother of all, and we are all his children. So it's also the prayer of unity, and what power there is in clearly knowing this and affirming it. You know, if each one of you took the Lord's Prayer, as I did, every day for 1 month, and really thought it through and applied it to whatever problems you have in your life or home or family or church or community or world, your life would be transformed. They would take on a new meaning, and you would be doing much for your world. The and founder of Christian Science cared deeply about her environment, thought deeply about it. Indeed, she was the first woman to discover the effect that our environment has upon us. But she discovered something even more important. She discovered that our environment is mental, and that we improve our environment by changing our thinking. It's not a change of environment that changes our thinking, but a change in our thinking that changes our environment. She discovered that. Not only did she discover it, she demonstrated it. She lived it. She realized at a very early age that we live in a mental realm or atmosphere. And when she herself was healed of a serious injury through reading the Bible, she realized that the power with which Jesus healed was still present, and she had a great thirst to discover just how this healing was accomplished. Now, her environment was not good at all at this time. She'd always been a very fragile child who had to be educated at home. Her dearest brother died at an early age. Then her mother. She had married young and her husband died, and she was left with a young child to bring up alone. She had very poor health and no money. Because of that, her child had to be taken from her and cared for by a family. Then she herself remarried in the hope that through this marriage, she would get her son back again. But that didn't work out either. Still, she went on with her quest for this truth. She had no money and no home of her own, so she knew all about false environment and suffering. Yet, in spite of all this, she had this great thirst after truth and spent all of her time studying the Bible and the healing works of Jesus until she discovered the science by which he healed. Then she dedicated the rest of her life founding this Christ science on the words and works of our beloved Master, Christ Jesus. It always interests me to read what she says of herself in Science and Health with Keys to the Scriptures. She says, in the year 1866, I discovered the Christ science, or divine laws of life, truth, and love, and named my discovery Christian Science. God had been graciously preparing me during many years for the reception of this final revelation of the absolute divine principle of scientific mental healing. I love the way she says, God had been graciously preparing me. She didn't give us a whole list of all the troubles that she'd had, or the things that she had to contend with or face up to. She said God had graciously been preparing her. Doesn't that tell us a lot about that woman? About her humility, her dignity, her faith in God? I think it says everything about her in that little paragraph. She wrote the Christian Science textbook, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. And by the way, if anyone here today would like a copy, they can have a free copy afterwards to take home. Any of the ushers will be very happy to help them. She wrote many other books. She founded her own church, which is worldwide, her own publishing society, and in her 87th year, she gave the world the Christian Science Monitor, a daily newspaper, because she cared about her environment. She did not like what the media were reporting, and she saw that we needed a better newspaper who would report fairly and would also, in their reporting, give us a way, lead us as to how to pray about the situations in our world. The Christian Science Monitor is still with us as a daily paper in America, and here in Britain we have, and in Europe, the weekly international paper. In America we also have Monitor Radio and Monitor Television, which are going out and doing a wonderful job. So these are proofs of her care for her environment. Of course, our environment does not begin and end simply with people, places, events, and circumstances. We have the wider environment of nature, the plants, the flowers, the trees, rivers, sky and sea, that sometimes we seem to be too worried by our problems or too busy to even enjoy. And today the world has become more than ever conscious of our environment because of the destruction to our earth. It's making us more environmentally conscious, and that's a good thing. We ought to be. We ought to know that our Father, who made us, made every blade of grass and loves it, made the trees and loves them and cares for them. And when we pray with our Father, with the Lord's Prayer, we should include all nature in it. This is the way to cleanse our environment. Then when we do that, easier ways will open up for people to know how to handle these difficulties. There is nowhere that God's tender love does not reach or embrace. We can help dissolve the layers of materialism that pollute and destroy our earth. This was brought home to me about just over 5 years ago. My family and I had just moved to a new house. Now, this house hadn't been lived in for many years. It needed a lot doing to it. We bought the house because it was a house that we could afford. But on the day that we moved in, it was snowing. The house was full of workmen. The whole house was being rewired. We were having central heating put in and a new kitchen. All the floorboards were up. There was no heating, no lighting. We didn't even have a cooker. When the furniture men came, there was hardly a place to set the furniture. In the middle of all this commotion, when I was beginning to think I'd taken on too much and made a terrible mistake in moving to this house, one of my sons was looking out the window, and he said to me, "Mom, what are we going to do about the garden?" Well, I said, "Paul, the garden is the least of my problems right now. I'm trying to sort out in here." He said, "Well, if you don't do something pretty soon," he said, it'll soon be the spring, "you won't have a garden for the summer. Have you seen the state of this garden?" he said. It was all overgrown. It was a semi-detached house, and the fence between us and the people next door had fallen down. The hedges were all falling out, and the grass was up to my waist. I said, "Yes, I have seen the garden. That's why I'm concentrating on in here." But as the day went on, I began to think, now just a minute, Myrtle, sort this out. You are supposed to be praying to know that God is taking care of you and yours, of your family, of this situation, of everything that's going on in this household and everything that has to be done. Well, do you think that God's loving care stops at your front door? Because if you do, you know, you're limiting God. Do you think God doesn't love the garden? And is God's work not finished? Is His plan not perfect and complete? So I said, "All right, God, I'll accept that. Your plan is perfect and complete. And the love that cares for me and mine and the children in this house will also care for the garden." So I decided to drop it. But you know, God's timing and ours are never the same. About 15 minutes later, the door knocked, and I went out, and there were my two young neighbours. And they had a lovely canister of tea, and they said, "We brought this to welcome you to our neighbourhood. We're so delighted to have a neighbour, because we've lived here so many years and no one has lived in that house." So I brought them into all the chaos and showed them what was going on and said, "I hope we're not too much of a nuisance." And they said, "What are you going to do about the garden?" And I thought, "Father, would you just get off my back? Because this is too soon." So I said, "Well, we're thinking about it." Well, they said, "You'd need to think pretty soon because you'll have no garden for the summer." I said, "I know, my son's just been telling me all that." They said, "Well, look, we are both lecturers at a local college, and we have 2 weeks off for Easter. So as a housewarming gift, we wondered, would you like us to do your garden?" Well, I couldn't believe it. Show you how good a prayer I am. I prayed, and when the answer came, I couldn't believe it. So they were very keen on gardening. So I said I would be delighted. We went out to the front door, and they said, "What are you going to do about this old fence?" And I said, "Well, as our gardens aren't very big, it might be nice if we didn't have a fence." And we had a nice sense of oneness. Well, they jumped up and down at the light, and they said, "We hoped that somebody would say that." So the next morning, 8 a.m., they were on my doorstep with their shovels and their spades. We ordered a large skip to take away all the rubbish, and my son and I went out to help them to clear out the garden. Now they were clearing away the old hedges and the old fences and so forth, but I noticed that my young neighbour had taken out an old rose tree and thrown it on top of this skip. Now I have a soft spot for roses, so I went and took this rose tree off the skip, and it looked completely dead, and it was full of weeds and all choked up with grass, and I began to clean it out. When my neighbour said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm cleaning out this rose tree, I'm going to plant it." He said, "You don't want that old thing in your garden, that would spoil your nice garden." And I said, "Well, I like roses." But there was something else at the back of my mind. I had been asked to pray for a woman who was suffering from old age. Nothing but old age. She had taken to her bed and decided to give up. She said she felt she was a nuisance to her family, that nobody wanted her, and she had decided to give up. Now, at first I went along with this, and I was thinking, well, she's a good age, she's had a good innings. But I began to see there's no healing in that, and I don't think that's the way to pray. What right have I, or she, or anybody to decide? Only God could decide that. So the God who decided that for my friend decided it for that rose. And I was going to plant that rose in the garden, and I didn't care what anybody said. I planted the rose. And I prayed for weeks for the rose, and I prayed for my friend. But the weeks went on. There was no sign of life in the rose, and there was very little sign of it in my friend. Well, one morning I had a telephone call from her son, and he said, "My mother's had a very difficult night, and I think she might be passing on, and perhaps I should get a doctor." He told me all the symptoms, and they didn't look good. Now, I felt really disappointed. I couldn't understand why, when I had prayed so faithfully, I didn't get better results for my prayer. So I didn't want the workmen to see that I was having a little weep. And I went out into the garden, and I looked at the rose tree, and there were 3 little dead sticks above the earth. And I grabbed hold of them, and I said, "Look at you. You're dead as a doornail." And do you know, underneath the ground were dozens of little white shoots, all ready to come through. Well, I kissed those white shoots and stuck it back into the ground. And my neighbour came out and he said, "What are you doing?" "I saw you taking that rose out." I thought, good. I said, "You just leave that rose there. That rose is doing okay." And I thought, and that's the same truth for that woman. And I don't care what the material senses are saying. And just at that, my neighbour said, "Your phone's ringing." And I ran in. It was the woman's son. He said, "I don't know what's happened to my mother. She's sitting out on the edge of the bed, says she's starving. She wants a large bowl of porridge." And my lovely rose bloomed. It was a yellow rose. And you know, it gave the nicest fragrance of all the roses in the garden. And on the first day that 2 blooms came out, I took 1 bloom, put it in a little vase, went into my neighbours. They were sitting having their dinner, and I said, "There's the rose you said was no use." And I took the other one when I went to visit my friend. And that was such a lesson to me. And I ended up with a lovely garden, a lovely open garden. These people went way down to the sea 30 miles every day and brought me stones and made a beautiful rockery. And even people in the buses used to tell me, we admire your garden so much. It's brightened the whole road. It was such a lovely proof and demonstration of God's care. But it proved to me that man is never too old, should never give up. He's not useless, unwanted, alone. There's another part of this belief about environment that I want to discuss. But before I do, I want to say this to you. If any part of my talk today has inspired you, I want you to take it home and make it grow. Because inspiration on its own is absolutely useless. It'll just die. If you all go home and say, that was a lovely, inspiring talk, and then forget about it, it'll never bear any fruits. If you came to my home and you saw a plant in my garden and you liked it, and you said, I'd like to have a piece of that, and I gave it to you, and you took it home and you nourished it, well, soon it would grow into a big plant, and you would be sharing with your friends, and they would share it with their friends. It would just keep right on going. But if you took that little piece of plant home and threw it in the back garden and said, well, it is a lovely plant, but I couldn't be bothered going out there to dig a hole and put it in there, nothing will ever come of it. It's the same with this lecture. If you do that, it won't bear fruit. It won't be my fault. It won't be the lecturer's fault. But let me tell you, next time I see you, I'm going to say, how's your plant? Now, the final part of this talk on environment, because, you know, we could talk about this for a week, this environment situation, is when we seem to be environed inside a material body, and we think there's no way of escape. Perhaps it's an incurable disease or a chronic disease, something that has happened, and there just doesn't seem to be any answer to it, even though you've prayed and prayed and prayed. Let me tell you, you should never give up. About 18 months ago, I was introduced to a young woman who was suffering from a disease called NE. I'm sure you've all heard about it. Something that wastes away the muscles. She'd had this disease for 7 years. When I met her, she'd been bedridden, completely bedridden, for over a year. She'd been to many, many doctors who had tried everything to help her. And they'd reached the stage where they didn't know what else to do. They told her husband it was just hopeless. There was nothing that they could do for her. They were giving her so many drugs that she couldn't eat, and she'd lost so much weight and was so weak that she couldn't even hold the telephone. It had to be propped up on a pillow. Now, she was the mother of 3 children. 2 of them were teenagers, and the youngest one was only 11. And for all those years, the environment in their home was not good. Her husband was a very busy, popular journalist. He was also the author of 9 books, a very busy young man. But when he came home from work every day, he had to cook meals, take the children shopping, see to all the things his wife couldn't see to, and she had to have someone there every day looking after their home. And she just couldn't stop crying. She said, when I went to see her, she said, why is this? Why should I have to die and leave my children when they need me so much? She asked me if Christian Science could heal her because she had tried many faith healing groups and everything in medicine, and nothing had helped. Well, I offered to pray for her. I went to visit her for 3 consecutive days, and every day when I went to visit her, she kept telling me about the disease, what she'd suffered from it, how it started, all the symptoms. She went over them and over them and over them. On the 3rd day, I said to her, this disease is called ME. Now, ME means me. And for 3 days, you've done nothing but talk about me. This mortal, physical me, which isn't really you at all. So I said to her, I would like to talk to you about you. A wonderful you that God made, that God knows, that God loves. And we began with the first chapter of Genesis, where God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. We read different things about man from the Christian Science textbook. We began to identify her correctly, and she began to respond very slowly at first. We read verses in the Bible like, I shall not die, but live, and declare the works of the Lord. And I will restore to you the years that the locust hath eaten. I saw that this woman needed her faith in God restored because it had taken an awful beating. She'd had a good religious upbringing, but her faith in God seemed to have taken a beating. And we began to talk about God and how God is love. Well, in a few days her husband had to go outside the country for 5 days, and he didn't know what to do with his wife because she didn't want to go into hospital. And I said that I would take her home. And I took her home, and during those 5 days we did nothing but talk about man's perfection and about this God who is love. And I'm pleased to be able to tell you that when her husband came home, she ran down the steps to meet him. And within a week, she was driving her own car. And the first night that they all went out together as a family, they went to the supermarket. And then they went for a meal together and sat round the table together for the first time as a family. And on their way home, they called to see me with an armful of flowers. And her husband, with tears in his eyes, said to me, I never thought I would be so happy to simply push a shopping trolley round the supermarket. He said it was the most wonderful thing. Their whole environment took on a whole new look. Life became wonderful. She and her husband used to get in the car, drive down to the sea, buy an ice cream and sit like 2 kids and eat it, just for the joy of living and being together. What a change in their environment. She didn't have to die or get out of her body. She had only to change her false concept of God and of herself. And you know, what's true for one is true for all. No matter what your problem seems to be today, and let's face it, everybody's got problems. No matter what it is, no matter how long it's lasted, no matter how many people know about it, no matter how discouraged you feel about it, not true, because it's not true to God. And there is an answer in truth to your problem. Take it to this God who is love. Remind yourself that God is love, that there's no one in this universe that he loves more than he loves each and every one of you. You're so precious in his sight. Or perhaps it's one of your loved ones who's at home that you're thinking about. Well, that tender, loving care is already there with them, and you have only to acknowledge it. Change your concept of your environment. Pray with the Lord's Prayer, because that has such power. And give God the glory. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. Amen. Thank you for being such a lovely audience.